Goodness gracious. We are live once again. Welcome everyone. Today is a bit of a special stream because this is the first special ultra short 1 hour long stream. But to make up for that, we're going to be streaming again, same time, 2 days from now on Thursday. So that's going to be a conlang focused stream. This one is going to be a language learning focused stream. And who better to talk with language learning about than Natasha Lipman, whom we had on the channel a few weeks back, and we have invited back today. And today we're going to be talking about more of the softer human side of language learning. So things like motivation, things like our emotions, anxiety, our feelings, our mindsets, our beliefs, and our attitudes about language learning and how they can help us or they can hold us back. So I think what we'll do, because this is a shorter stream, I won't prattle on too much. Why don't I just jump over and let's talk to Natasha. Okay, there we are. Natasha, say hello.
Hello.
We are live. So yeah,
it's very exciting.
Today is very exciting. We're going to be talking about motivation. But people are going to be joining us on YouTube later on, so maybe it's a good idea for you to introduce yourself to those who don't know you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Natasha Lipman. I am a journalist. I have just gone freelance after working at the BBC for several years. I am a writer specializing in chronic illness and disability, and I am a part-time language learner, newbie, trying to figure this all out, very dependent on Colin, very exciting. And I'm here to kind of give the newbie perspective on language learning.
Excellent. So that means that any kind of wonky tangents I go off onto, Natasha's there to sort of rein me and say, does this really matter? Is this really applicable to the vast majority of people?
Sorry, please.
Oh, I was going to say, so that's, hopefully something that can benefit everyone.
I hope so. And I think as you said, we've got quite a few things that we wanted to talk about today in our shorter time frame. So can I ask you a question before we get started?
Please do.
One of the things that we talk about a lot is input-based language learning, and it's been quite interesting talking to people about this because I've been evangelizing about it, but I think you'd probably be better at selling it than I would. Could we talk a little bit about what that actually is?
So if this is a completely new term to you, input-based methods for language learning, this is basically the idea that instead of going and trying to learn things about the language, like learn vocabulary, learn verb charts, learn all sorts of grammatical rules, doing lots of drilling exercises and things like that. The best way to learn a language is to expose yourself to as much of the language as possible, and specifically to material in the language where you're trying to work out what is being communicated to you, and you're able to do that. So the level of the material is not so high that you don't understand anything, but it's also not so low that you can understand it effortlessly. So you're working out, trying to negotiate the meaning that's being communicated to you, and you're being exposed to new bits of the language. So this is what's often called comprehensible input. And so the idea behind input-based methods, and these are pretty well supported in the literature, is that these are the best. This is the best way to do it, to expose yourself to as much input as possible of this kind of Goldilocks comprehensible nature. So not too hard, not too easy. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what an input-based approach looks like.
So where this is quite interesting is that it feels so opposite to the traditional way of learning a language that we learn in schools. And in our last stream, we kind of talked about that and why it doesn't work for the vast majority of people. I have been genuinely shocked that I know all the things I know. We're learning Yiddish together, that I know all the things that I know without knowing that I know it, because we've been doing input-based methods, using input-based methods. So for example, this Sunday, I went to a Yiddish organization did like a special winter program, and I went to a class with a new teacher. It was like a one-off event, and it turned into a grammar class, which we have a whole picture of me up on your channel, basically declaring that I'm a grammarphobe, which is true. And I was really freaked out before we went on, because I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to understand. I'm not going to be able to know this. And it was really quite bizarre, because we were talking about the conditional. I wouldn't have known what the conditional was, like if someone just said to do the conditional. And there were parts of it where they were reading through a textbook, and it was very like, this grammatical term and that grammatical term, if this then that, and then that, and I couldn't follow any of that, and my brain just completely shuts down. But when we had examples of saying, okay, when we have this sentence and you want to transform it, it transforms like this. When I saw the examples in my brain, I was like, I've heard this before, I've used this before, and I was able mostly to get the things right. But I never sat down and formally learned it, but I have heard it over the last year enough that I was able to keep up, even when those terms that I kept hearing, literally I was sitting there like this because I was so worried I wouldn't be able to do it. And I think in a way that's quite a good example of how these methods can work.
Yeah, like you're saying, you encountered a grammatical construction in a formal context this time, and you're hearing that it has this name and that it works in such and such a way. And this is coming up against a different kind of knowledge that you have about this construction, which is the knowledge of how to use it and the experience of having used it in your own speech and having listened to people use it. And so these two things, even though in a way they're sort of describing the same phenomenon, when you want to make a statement, a particular type of statement in Yiddish, say like a conditional statement, and equivalent to the English would, I would do this kind of thing. You can talk about this and you can give it a name and you can make charts about how it works, or you can encounter it in the wild and come to that same kind of representation, and perhaps even a better representation of that same construction over a sufficient amount of time. And so that's the route that you took. And then it's really interesting to note, the difference between the two, because you're coming into a formal class with a representation of this construction already built up in your mind. And then you're learning it has a name. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but for a grammarphobe, this may be the ideal way to approach grammar, having already learned it.
So I took the class with Sebastian, and he literally was sitting there being like, you haven't started crying yet. You are not freaking out. You survived this thing. And I was like, wow, I did. And I was like very proud of myself. And I think I found myself shutting down when I heard these grammatical terms. And if I had to have learned it purely then and there, I wouldn't have learned it. And I wouldn't have been able to figure it out, because I would have shut down, because there are it was explained using a bunch of terms that I didn't have a good grasp of and understanding in English. And that I obviously have some block in my brain about it anyway, because in my head I'm like, I don't know this stuff, therefore I can't do it. But it turns out I could do it, and I do know it. It's just that when I am presented with tables and charts and structures, unless I've already started using something and I understand it a bit, it doesn't work for me. and I need to kind of just hear things used correctly over and over again, to be able to start thinking about that. And I think that takes us quite nicely into the idea of where do we find comprehensible input, because it can be so dependent on the language that you're learning, or what level that you're at. So, for example, with Yiddish, it's quite hard to find comprehensible input. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So this is, once you start, going down this route of input-based approaches, you're looking for comprehensible input. This is the question that immediately comes up. Okay, I want comprehensible input. How on earth do I find it? There is a kind of gold standard that I advocate, that I've benefited from, which is to have a teacher who is a speaker of the language and who knows your level. And so the teacher is then going to be able to work with you in conversation to generate all this comprehensible input. Every conversation you have with this teacher in the target language will be comprehensible input, because you can imagine sitting there with a teacher or on Zoom or wherever, and the teacher says something and you start to look, you give one of these faces, the sort of the blank stare, the look of incomprehension. That's a signal.
So can I just say, I don't know if I've done something wrong. I can't see you. I'm currently talking to like a gray square. So if I'm not responding to any facial expressions, it's because I can't see you.
Yeah, the technical limitations of doing interviews on stream. But I'm doing, yeah. So Natasha, for those of you who are listening with the screen off, or for Natasha, I'm giving a blank. I'm giving a sort of an incredulous look, a look of
Thank you.
What in the high heavens did you just say? And when your teacher sees you doing this, your teacher will naturally, if we're talking about a good teacher, we'll take another tack. We'll redescribe. We'll give a synonym. We'll explain in other words, thereby making the whole thing, which was sailing above comprehensible input, now fall right within that Goldilocks zone where you're able to get the meaning that was intended in that communication. And so this is wonderful. And if you have a teacher like this, and you have a say like one class a week for an hour, that's an hour of comprehensive. That's like an hour of really good grade A, blue ribbon comprehensible input that you're getting a week. And that's quite amazing, because it's virtually 100% going to be of use to you. So that's the gold standard. There are other ways. And here's where it becomes more dependent on your level and more dependent on the language and the resources available. So there are things like the typical kind of internet content, right? Podcasts, YouTube, streamers, websites, web comics, I don't know, this kind of thing. And depending on the language you're learning, this will be either a gigantic ocean of content or a very, very small puddle. And this is where, if you're learning,
we're paddling in the Yiddish puddle.
If you're learning a language where the ocean of content looks more like a puddle or a small pond, then it becomes a lot more difficult. And this is the case for so many languages. So that's where some creativity has to come in. This is where I like to really rely a little bit more on the teachers if one is available. I know that's not always available. But you can do things like, children's books. You can start, go into more traditional media. Are there newspapers? Are there radio shows? Are there books? Chances are there will be something. And if you're in a case where there's truly nothing, there may be, you may be in a situation where you just have to take what you can get. And this gets at the sort of other side of comprehensible input, which is that you want input that's not only comprehensible, but compelling, because there's, as we're about to discuss more, your motivation's supremely important. And if there's some sort of hesitation or something holding you back from consuming a particular type of content, you're less likely to do it. You're going to get fewer hours in, and your progress is going to be slower because you've had less input. And so if you can find, this is where it gets tricky. If you can find that stuff that's comprehensible and compelling, just, hang on for dear life and read, listen, watch, whatever that is. This is another case where a teacher, if it's a good teacher, becomes really beneficial because usually they're going to be talking to you about you, right? And what's more compelling to any given person than themselves? That's an easy way to get your attention. But when you're reading works of literature or listening to podcasts, you don't have that kind of narcissistic help. So that's why I always say, if you can get a teacher and a good one, go for it. That's going to be the best strategy. And then otherwise, you're going to have to try and find your way into the content sea and look for things that work for you. But the nice thing is, you'll know when you encounter a bit of content, you'll know if it's roughly in that Goldilocks zone of it's not too hard, it's not too easy. If it's too hard, it'll be a painful experience to read, listen, watch, whatever. If it's too easy, you'll fly through, and you might get a little bit bored, depending on whether it's truly compelling. If it's truly compelling, you won't notice. You won't even notice it's in another language. But if it's a little bit lower down on that scale, you may just, okay, see spot run, this kind of thing. You'll know fairly quickly whether you're at that kind of good spot in the comprehensibility range.
I would say for us, we were really dependent on a teacher for comprehensible input for a very long time, because we could find comprehensible input at our beginner level, but so much of it just wasn't very compelling. It was kids' books. It wasn't things that we were particularly interested in. And it was mostly conversations that were about us, so obviously we cared, that made it so much easier over time to develop those things that now we can start actually engaging in input that is comprehensible and compelling. One other thing that you didn't mention that I think was really important is we went to a conversation group at our level, and it was a guided conversation group. So there was a speaker in there kind of navigating us through it. So it gave us more input, and it gave us the opportunity to experiment with speaking, and it gave us more time with the language every week, which was really important. And then when we were able to go up a group, that was like very exciting. And then you got to kind of speak to a few people who were native speakers. And it, I found the groups really, really helpful. And now there's a group that meets. I don't go to the live ones, but I watch the video, and someone comes and gives a presentation. And I find that when I watch the presentations, I can understand the gist of everything that's going on. I can basically follow along everything. And then I watch it again, and there'll be like the odd vocab word that I'm like, oh, I didn't know that word. And then I look up that vocab word, and then I've made it 100% comprehensible to me. But it was comprehensible enough that I could follow what was going on. But it's kind of almost like when you're reading an academic book and you don't know some of the terms that are being used, but you still know what's going on, even in English. So I think that's kind of been how we've been able to make progress.
It's interesting when you get to this. So when you get to this situation where you get the gist, and then there's this one word that keeps showing up over and over again, do you go over to the dictionary? Do you look it up? Do you try and work it out from context? I know one thing that's an easy trap to fall into when you're reading is just every time you come up against something that you don't know, to go over to the dictionary and look it up. I've found this is not a great strategy. This was definitely my first approach, and something I did for many years. And it just ended up meaning that the amount of time I spent reading was so much less, because reading the dictionary doesn't really count, and you have to flip through the pages, and that's all time taken away from reading, and you go out of it over and over again. So that's why it's important to find the stuff at that nice Goldilocks level. Then if you are the kind of person who will go over to the dictionary, you won't do it so often that it will cause you much trouble.
The times that I do it is generally like I have no idea what the sentence means without like this vital word. Like there's been a couple of times where like I completely misinterpreted because I didn't know what like a phrase meant
You
or
get
what a word meant.
you get a sentence like, whatever you do, be sure that you never blank the blank. It's like, okay, well, that I think I really need some help with.
Exactly. One of the things that you mentioned before is the role of motivation when it comes to language learning, and the role that motivation can play in our ability to make progress when it comes to language learning. This is something that I have found really quite significant. I learned French in France and I was very motivated, but I didn't like school because it was like traditional methods that we talked about that I do not like. But I was motivated to learn the language through an immersion. I came home and I realized I wasn't going to live in France. So I kind of quit. And I've tried learning different languages. I started an Arabic class. I thought many times that I should learn German because my fiance is German. I never wanted to learn German, which is now funny that I'm learning Yiddish, but I never wanted to learn German. So I would start and I'd buy these books and I'd buy all these different things, hoping that it would motivate me to learn. And then I do it for a few weeks. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. My motivation was not there at all. Whereas now, with Yiddish specifically, it's a language I've always wanted to learn, and I'm very highly motivated to learn it. And even when I've been having a hard time and not had the time or energy to give to it, I've still wanted to. And this is a topic that we've been discussing this month in our newsletter. How do you feel about motivation?
There will be a link for that somewhere up here, everyone. So with motivation, I kind of liken it to the case where someone decides, it's January 1st, I'm going to get really into exercise this year. I don't know if anyone's ever done this. I've certainly done this. I'm going to get really into exercise. I'm going to get really healthy this year. Is this going to be the year, right? And then, you have a few weeks where you do it. And then you find your motivation's flagging a bit, and then you try and buy some new, some exercise clothes or buy some exercise equipment. Like, that's going to motivate me. This is kind of like what happens when we are learning a language because we feel we should, or, it seems convenient. Oh, I know someone who speaks this language. I want to learn a language. I might as well speak that language without a compelling personal need to do so. And then you buy resources, you buy books, you buy courses, blah, blah, blah. And it just doesn't seem to give you that motivation that you're looking for. And then inevitably what's happened with me in these cases is, especially with the fitness case, is that, it's one of these New Year's resolutions that doesn't get followed through on. Contrast that with the situation where you have a hobby that you just can't stop yourself from doing. I'm sure everyone has something like this in their lives. I hope everyone has something like this in their lives where you actually have to be told to stop. Maybe you have a family member who says, stop playing video games until, all hours of the night, stop reading, go to bed, this kind of thing. Come inside, stop playing hockey. I don't know what it is, whatever it is for you. There's likely something. And learning a language can be one of these things too, under the right circumstances, when the motivation is there. And Natasha, for you, you've had this contrast between your experience learning German and your experience learning Yiddish. And we can't ascribe the difference between these two situations to the fact that one language is radically different, much more difficult than the other. Obviously there are differences, but we're talking about languages from the same family. And so we're not, we have to look elsewhere for the difference. So what was the big difference for you?
I was just going to ask first, how would we define motivation here? Because we're talking about motivation, but how would we define it?
Oh, well, never ask an academic to define anything. That's just a surefire recipe for misery. Motivation, I would define motivation as the thing that animates you to start doing something and that keeps you doing that thing. I think maybe that could be a good working definition for us. So it not only is the thing that gives you that idea in the first place and I'm going to learn I'm going to learn Russian. That could be a passing whim. The motivation should also, in order to be true motivation, it should be the thing that keeps you at it, keeps you coming back to Russian or Japanese or whatever. So those two elements, that initial desire and then the maintenance of the action that actually moves you towards the goal.
So I would say for me, my initial desire was personal. It's a family language that didn't get passed on. A lot of people had a similar thing where the grandparents spoke it, and then their parents could understand some of it, but it was the language that the grandparents spoke in, so that the parents couldn't understand. And then there's quite interesting other dimensions with Yiddish in terms of assimilation and people not wanting to feel different, and I find all of that really interesting. I always just thought it was an interesting language. I always wanted my grandma to teach me. She would make quips when I said it. And I just, with the pandemic, I finally got an opportunity to be able to participate in that because things went online. So I think my motivation was just something I'd always wanted to learn, and it connected me very quickly, actually. It connected me to my own personal history and culture in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And it just meant that it opened up this much wider world of, for want of a better term, Jewish stuff that I hadn't known about. And it's a much broader, I'm not going to go on a rant about like how bad Jewish education is for people, but it was a really enlightening thing that I got a huge amount out of. And then as I started to learn, I loved the language more and more. And then I was excited about the idea of being able to access these things that I was starting to read in translation, and all of this other stuff for when my level got better. And then I started making progress, and I got really excited that a year ago I could say a few rude things that I learned from my grandma, and that was it. And now I can hold several hour conversations, again, like not perfectly. I'm not even pretending I'm anywhere near fluent, and we can get into a conversation about what that is another time. But it's become like a self-fulfilling thing because my inherent motivation and reason for wanting to learn it was really strong. The more I've been able to engage with it and make improvements, the more I've been able to engage with the things that I want to engage with, which I think is really great. And I want to do my teacher proud. Like I want to be able to make progress, and I want to keep being able to have conversations and doing these things. And this year where I'm going to a weekend event that's a full Yiddish immersion, and I'm really motivated to like get better for that so I don't feel like I'm the worst one there. So I find that guilt plays quite a good role in it too for me, which is probably the most Jewish of things. But it's I suppose for me it's a combination of all of those things. But you're quite interesting when it comes to language learning, because like you find it hard to stop learning new languages. Like you just pick them up all the time.
It's hard for me to stop. It's hard for me to actually restrain myself. This keeps happening to me, and it's probably bad, but I'll be on Twitter, or I have certain mailing list things that I get, and I'll see someone say, "Oh, hey, we're doing a special 8-week course on so and so language," and I'll think, can I do it? Or rather, can I not do it?
And you've been complaining about how you have no time and you're so busy, and then your message being like, I've signed up for a new language course.
I know. This is probably my my Shakespearean flaw. In Act 5, everyone's dead, and it's because I learned too many languages. It's the way it is. I don't think I can change that about myself. But I have this weird relationship with motivation where I have a very, very, very strong motivation to learn languages in general. Where that gets channeled, what languages that get channeled into, that's where it varies, from week to week, from month to month. And so something will trigger my desire to get back into a language or to pick up a new language. I don't know how relatable this is to other people. Maybe some of the viewers on the stream will identify with this, but I'll think of a book that I really want to read, and I'll think, oh, if only I could read that in the original language, and then that will give me a few months of motivation. Or I really like the feeling of speaking this language. I had a fun time doing it. I want to recapture that experience, so I'll do it again. But I'm odd. I mean, I think there's no question about that.
No one would deny that.
No.
But, but when it comes to language learning, why is motivation so important? What role can motivation play in the long run?
Well, it's interesting. I think the most straightforward answer is that strong motivation keeps you coming back. And the more time you spend consuming the language, the better your progress will be. So it may be as simple as that. It may be as simple as people who do more, who get more input, advance faster, and therefore anything you can do to get yourself more input is going to help you. And motivation, that may be the end of it. There may be something else as well. Maybe motivation puts you in a particular state where you're better able to acquire based on input. I do not know. That's something that sounds plausible. Maybe someone studied that I haven't read. We know that there's a good association of motivation and outcomes in language acquisition and second language acquisition. This is one of the motivation is one of the factors that people try to look to explain individual differences in language acquisition. So why is it that person A does so much better than person B in the same course of study? Often these things are this research is done on people in formal education settings. But why does A do better than B? Is A more talented? Is A more motivated? Is A more chilled out, extroverted? People look for all of these potential explanations. Motivation is one that's there's been decades of work looking into, and so, but the exact mechanism, that's where I don't know.
I mean, surely part of it is also you're less likely to quit if you have an inherent motivation to learn a language. Like, I didn't want to learn German, and as soon as something else got in the way, I quit because I didn't want to learn it in the first place. It was like there wasn't something keeping me coming back for it.
Yeah, and if you don't come, the best way to fail, the easiest way to fail is to quit, right? And so anything you can do to avoid that eventuality will be a good thing. But I want to pick up on one thing that you said, Natasha, about your motivation, which you didn't say it in so many words, but I kept picking up on the sense of the social or the community element of it. You have now a new community of Yiddish speakers, Yiddish learners, that you are now part of. And this language has unlocked the door to that. Do you think that's made a big difference for you?
I love old Jews. I love them. And so like being able to like make friends with older people that speak the language, and it's been really motivating and really fun. And I think you've got the opportunity to listen to people's stories, and Yiddish is so tied up with so many interesting historical things, and everyone has a story. A lot of it is, not the most pleasant thing, but everyone has these amazing stories, and you've automatically kind of gone in to listen and to learn from other people. And I think that has been very motivating and very fun, but that has also come with the ability, like that has grown as the ability to communicate has grown, because as we've spoken about before, if you can't communicate in a way that makes you feel like you can be understood, it's quite hard and isolating. So yeah, the community element has definitely played a role in that, but I think that's only going to develop over time when my confidence and ability with the language grows as well.
So as you look back on your last year or so of experience learning Yiddish, people are going to be watching this video. They have their own languages. They're learning their own reasons for doing so. Is there anything that you could sort of give them a word of advice? What would you leave them with in terms of motivation?
There's a reason you started learning a language, and I don't know if people always consciously think about what that is, but I think taking time to think about the reason that you started, and whether it is something that you want to do long term. Like, for example, for you, it's quite interesting. Like, for me, I know that Yiddish is a long term language that I want to learn. Because you're pathological with language learning, you don't want to spend like years and years learning some languages, right? Like, some of them you're happy to dip in and out of, to do for a specific purpose, and they're all completely valid reasons for learning a language. And I think if you can tie your motivation in with the understanding of why and what you want to do with the language, and that can change, I think that could be quite helpful. What do you think?
I think that's exactly it. And I would add not to confuse or not to mix up your motivations for learning different languages. So if you are the kind of person who learns multiple languages, maybe the motivation for one is that you want to speak with your in-laws, and motivation for another one is that you want to read this one particular text from, 2,000 years ago, and maybe another one is that you just like the grammar. And I know that, okay, that might just be me. I don't know. But don't feel that you have to do the same thing for all of them. If you really want to just learn to read in one, maybe that will influence how much time you spend on it. Maybe it'll influence the activities you do, versus something that you're more interested in conversation for. That will affect how you go about learning. So I think know your why, keep it at the forefront of your mind, and don't mix it up. And that would be my advice.
It's quite interesting though, because all of these things are so, like, for any hobby or for any kind of, for want of a better word, self-improvement, not that you have to be learning a language for self-improvement, but like for any kind of activity that somebody could do, so many of these tips just apply to everything, right? Like, understand your motivation, understand all of these things. And another thing that is really, really important is understanding your mindset. And understanding the mindsets that can set you up for success in whatever thing you're trying to do. And when it comes to language learning, mindsets can play like a surprisingly quite a substantial role.
This is true. What your sort of stable background beliefs about the language you're learning, about yourself, about the nature of language learning, all of these things can have an impact. When we think about our attitudes towards the target language, we all are coming to language learning for different reasons, as we've established. You're going to have a history with this language. What's that history like? Do you have some sort of lingering negativity, maybe that came from an earlier experience of trying and not succeeding to learn the language in school? Maybe you had a bad teacher. Maybe I don't know exactly what the history is, but sometimes there can be this kind of lingering negativity that can create a certain psychological distance between you and the language. And this is not a good thing. If you can't bring yourself psychologically close to the language, if there's some sort of negativity associated with the language, this is going to cause trouble.
See, this is I used to joke about this, but it's a big reason why I didn't want to learn German. Like, there are historical reasons why German as a language has never appealed to me. And while I can kind of get over that in like day-to-day life, as a language, it's not something that I was like, yes, this is the language that I want to spend all of my time trying to learn. And what's funny now is that with Yiddish, if I learned German, if we ended up moving to Germany, that would be a different thing. I would have a different motivation because I want to communicate with people while I was living there. I would obviously want to be fluent in the language. But now part of me is like, eventually, when I have a much more stable representation of Yiddish in my head, I'd be quite curious to learn German, purely so I could see where it's different from Yiddish and to see where the influences are, which I never had that mindset around German before.
That's really interesting. And I find this kind of comparative motivation to be a really fun one. And this might be this might be mostly a me thing. maybe some of you share this, when you learn languages that are from the same family, it can be a great deal of fun. It's like looking at a family portrait and seeing the slightly different ways that everyone's turned out, but you can see the family resemblance. It's really cool. Um, Another kind of aspect of mindset that we can talk about is your beliefs about yourself. And this is where it gets kind of fuzzy, and I don't know exactly what the scientific basis is for this stuff, but this is kind of coming from my own experience. If I can imagine a version of myself who speaks the language, for some reason I can do this more easily in some languages than others. I have no idea why. Get me on the couch and, talk to me about my dreams maybe, and then, we could get to the bottom of it. But if I can imagine sort of my own, an alternate history version of myself, an alternate universe version of myself that speaks this other language, I find it much easier to, especially past that upper intermediate zone, to start to acquire better pronunciation, to just sort of identify myself more with the language. I don't know. This is something that has me scratching my head a bit, but it really does seem to be there.
Something that I noticed when I spoke a pretty good level of French, I felt like French was a better language to get angry in. Like there's something about different languages that you have different vibes for, or almost like different aspects of your personality. And I know people that speak multiple languages that have kind of not different personas because they're still them, but it's like different aspects of their personality come out more depending on the language that they speak. Is that tied up with that?
Yeah, I think it is. And you'll hear people report this all over the place. People will say that they don't really feel at home in a particular language, or alternatively, you'll have people say, I really feel like I can come alive in this other language. You hear people report this, in terms of the science. I don't know. I think there has been some research done to mixed results, but subjectively and anecdotally, it does seem to be the case. So I think there's got to be something there. And it can tie into this whole sort of soup of influences that are coming in to make your individual experience learning a language different from someone else's. We know that especially pronunciation is very tied up with issues of personal identity. How we sound and who we are, these two concepts are very tightly linked. And that's why there can be a kind of strange experience when you're learning a new language, because you're going to have to give up this thing that's very attached to your sense of who you are, how you sound. And you're going to have to adopt something else. This has something to do with that version of yourself who speaks the language. Can you kind of come up with an identity for yourself in this language? There's some really strange result, which it has to do with altered ego states, specifically drunkenness. So alcohol intoxication. There was a study done, somewhat controversial study back in the 70s, that showed that people's pronunciation got better as they got drunk. And then, it quite steeply dropped off after they had a certain number of drinks. I don't remember what it was. Not advocating anyone does this. But it's interesting because the effects of alcohol are pretty much negative across the board for everything to do with language, except for that one. And so the hypothesis was that this involved some kind of blurring of the ego boundaries. You felt more free to not be yourself, something like that.
Is there also something, see, when you're drunk, you don't actually know what's coming out of your mouth. So, but I always felt that when I was in France and I'd had something to drink, I could get over my fear of being wrong. Again, I'm assuming there's a limit to how many drinks can do that, that if it can kind of help you get out of your own way a little bit. Does the research back that up, or is that just you think you speak the language better because you're drunk?
I don't know. The interpretation that I've seen is the idea that the lowered inhibitions make you more able to step outside yourself. but maybe it does have to do something to do with anxiety around the language as well.
Like I even found that, I mentioned that we took a class with a new teacher and new people the other day, that one-off class, and I was so nervous for hours beforehand because I was like, I don't want to look like I don't know anything. Is it too high a level for me? What do you know what I mean? And I think that plays such a huge role. And I suppose it's slightly shifting away, but it is still a mindset thing, because when you're talking about like fear of being wrong or fear of looking silly in front of people, I think that plays a huge role for so many language learners, because you can't communicate the way you would want to, and you don't want to come across in a way that doesn't feel authentic to you. And also, a lot of people, especially me, I don't like being wrong. Like it's embarrassing if you can't say what you want to say, or you feel like you're getting something wrong. And so getting to a point where you can be in an environment where you're okay making mistakes, I think plays a really huge role. But then there's a step from being in your little safe environment where you're kind of expected to make mistakes, and that's completely fine, and you don't even think about it. Like, we've been told off many times for apologizing for not knowing something. And I've started to internalize that, and that's been really helpful. But then as soon as I'm like stepping out, going into a new thing, I'm just like, oh, I get a bit of imposter syndrome. Should I be here? What am I saying? Like, can I talk about this yet? Like, I'm not good enough yet. And um, I never had it to that extent with anything except language. But then language is so fundamental to who we are. And I think also maybe for me, there's like an extra thing, like I'm a writer, like communication is my job. So it's there's so many things that are tied up, as you were saying, with our identity there.
Language anxiety is such a real thing, and it seems to be uniquely powerful at destroying your ability to learn, which is a shame because it shows up whenever you're in these situations where you're most likely to learn. And so how do we deal with that? This becomes a big thing to manage in our language learning practice. I think getting into the situations like you mentioned, where you have a supportive group, people who don't want to hear apologies, who are just letting you speak, and giving you the good input that you need, is wonderful. If you can get that, highly recommended. Another thing to do might be to alter your mindset. Talking about mindset, right? About language learning. Why hasn't language learning worked for you in the past? Where does this anxiety come from? Do you feel as if it shows that you're failing? Because in fact it does not. If you've had negative experiences learning language in the past, it could be just merely that you didn't have a good method. Not that there's anything wrong with you or there's anything wrong with the language, but the method wasn't working. And now that you have a better method, you can go forward. Or you may have unrealistic beliefs about the nature of language learning. How long does it take? What kind of level am I likely to attain? All of these
That is
kinds of
such a
things.
huge one. I think it is such a huge one, because with so many hobbies or so many things, like a year feels like a really long time, right? You're like, it like, what should I be able to do in a year? But when it comes to language learning, how many hours we're putting in is going to vary depending on everyone. What we want to get out of it is going to vary depending on who you are, how much energy you have to put towards something, the other things in your life that get in the way. There's so many elements that go into that. And I do think that so many people, there's something to be said about like the clickbait, like you can learn something in a month, and what that could do to people who are trying to learn a language. Because I think if you're not picking up things to the same extent as other people, or for example, you are a very experienced language learner. Sebastian is a very experienced language learner. Um, you both have a major head start over me when it comes to language learning. So because I'm learning with you, and also you both speak German, obviously he's a native German speaker, it's different, but like you both speak German, which means that you already had several steps up from me there. So for me, if I was going and comparing myself to you guys as language learners and you guys as German speakers, I'd be crying all the time. It was hard for me at the beginning because I was like, oh, I'm the worst one here. And I'm like being the worst one. And it's in a way, like eventually it became motivating. But um yeah, it's really very challenging when you are going in and you're thinking like, I should be at X level in X amount of time.
Yeah, where does that? Well, first of all, before I say anything else, I just want to, for the record, state that I wouldn't call myself a German speaker.
Okay,
I'm
you've learned
somewhere
German.
I'm somewhere along the pathway up Mount German. Well, we can say that. But
I haven't even stepped in the rubble at the base of Mount German. So that was.
but um, but I think it's worth asking, where does this idea come from that you can learn X amount of a language in a month? Is it from YouTube? Is it from like YouTube clickbait? I mean, I'm as guilty of clickbait as the next person, but I'm hoping I'm not setting people up with those kinds of expectations because, yeah, you can learn something in a month. Of course you can. But
Also, what is a month? Is it 15 minutes a day? Is it 20 hours, or not 20 hours a day, but or like 4 hours a day?
mm-hmm.
Like, what does a month mean? And what are you doing with your 20 minutes or your 4 hours in a day?
Yeah.
That complete, like, a month is like a meaningless thing. It's like, do you know what it's like? I've just realized this is probably going to be really bad now. I'm hyping up. You know, when you have these book reading platform thingies and you can have a reading goal for the year and you can say, I want to read 40 books this year. You could read 40 books that are 20 pages each and still tick that goal off. And people do that, right? They get to the end of the year and they're like, oh, I'm 5 behind. I'm going to read really, really short books just to be able to reach that milestone. When actually, like, there might be somebody else who predominantly reads books that are over 500 pages and they might read a lot less, but they read the books that are really meaningful to them. They've spent time to be really specific about what they're reading. They're not just reading to meet a number.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, I think there are some overlaps there.
Yeah, there is. This is something that Bill Van Patten mentions in his second language acquisition podcast, which it's no longer running, but you can listen to it. It's very good, called Tea with BVP. And he mentions that language, when we're talking about language acquisition, we're not measuring years. People can say, I've studied French for 5 years. What does that mean? Measure it in hours. How many hours of input of French did you have in those 5 years? Because that could be completely different for you versus for someone else. And when we talk about the differences between first and second language acquisition, this really comes into sharp focus. You know, a baby will learn, will acquire the language in so ever many years. And I've been studying for the same amount, and look at me, I'm nowhere near what this child has. But you really haven't been putting in the hours like the kid has, because you are an adult and you have other things to do. You're not just focused on, eating and acquiring.
The other thing as well, like, we've had this conversation about reading in Yiddish and the Yiddish alphabet, right? Like, I think we're slower than we would like to be at this point, but we barely read anything in our own time. We don't put any time into it. Mm-hmm. So the only reading we do is when we're in class, really. I'm trying to do a little bit more outside of class, and I do that occasionally, but there's no way that I spend a portion of every single day dedicated to the reading. Whereas, as you said, like with reading in English, we have done that since we were very young children, and we did it every day, and both of us are massive bookworms. The reason I'm such a fast reader, I don't know if it's a reason, but like, I read all the time. I read a lot. That plays a role in my ability to read. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. Yeah, there's a kind of bottleneck where, especially in a language with a different writing system, where you're just not able to read that much for quite a while. And remember, we learn to read so much later than we learn to speak in our first language. It's kind of odd in second languages that we try and do them both at the same time, in a way.
And the other thing with that as well is that Sebastian, for example, picked up reading in Yiddish much quicker than me. Part of it is because he's like very, very good with pattern recognition, but also he knew a bunch of the words that were very similar to German words, which meant that he could, when we read, we're not sounding all the letters out to then figure out what the word is. We're looking at a word and we're making a calculation of what is this word based on all of the information we already have in our mind about all the words we know in English. So because we didn't know many words, especially at the beginning, reading is becoming easier. Now we know more words and we can look at the letters and understand them to be a meaningful piece of input into our brain.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, as I read, I notice myself making mistakes where I'll take a few of the letters and I'll give a guess as to what the context determines.
You made an assumption.
You make an assumption, and then you think, wait, I actually didn't see that word at all. I just sort of glanced, made a snap judgment, and it was wrong. But usually it's not wrong. And the more you get, the better you're able to do those things. Yeah. One thing I think I'd like to make sure we do is just spend a little time addressing the questions that have come in from the chat as we've been discussing, because they've been sailing in. So Violet Beauregard mentions one thing that really helps you grasp a language's phonology is cognates. So some stuff like music theory is so technical that the vocabulary is 50% English. Extremely technical stuff you already know is also a great source of CI because you do know what's being said. You just don't know what words the speaker of this language means. This is absolutely true. Even if it's not, say we're talking about English and French or English and Spanish or English and German, you're going to have so many cognates between these languages, they're related. But it's not just that there are always cognates in technical languages, it's that the concepts are much more isomorphic. So when you're talking about abstract things or technical things, usually the translations between even unrelated languages, so English and Mandarin, if I read linguistics in Mandarin, it's a lot easier than me reading about someone, how someone went about their day, because the words that are being used in these technical contexts usually are one-to-one mappings between English and these other languages. Not always, but vast majority of the case. Whereas if you want to talk about a recipe, or talking about how someone moved around a desk in order to, they shimmied by something and they deked through, and all these kinds of words that they have basically no one-to-one mappings from language to language. And so this is a mistake that I made before I realized this. You may think that technical stuff is among the hardest for comprehensible input, but it's actually among the easiest, especially if it's something in an area that you understand well. So that's just like free comprehensibility. So read about the stuff that you do for your job. It's a good way of doing it, if that stuff indeed exists in the target language. Yeah. Thoughts on that, Natasha?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I I don't really have anything to add. I have found that it has been, definitely, because I've learned Yiddish and I've learned French. There's definitely times where cognates have been super helpful. I have nothing of value to add to this. Next question.
And then Sebastian says that he's read physics papers in French before. And he's always found that a book you know really well and don't mind reading over and over again is very helpful for comprehensible input. I've definitely done this with the first Harry Potter book in Scots. That was a lot of fun.
I have that in Yiddish. We just started reading it. It's very difficult for me at the moment. But actually, because Sebastian can understand a lot more of it than I can, we've been doing it together, and he reads in advance and he can read more. And then I come in and I'm like, I don't understand. And then we can talk about it. And then I understand it.
I will say, anyone trying to do this Harry Potter strategy, maybe we're assuming that you've read the book before, start at chapter 2. Chapter 1 is actually, the language in English is actually a lot harder. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll feel better about myself when we get to chapter 2.
Yeah, that's a little pro tip. When you get to dialogue and action scenes, it's a lot better. When you get into long descriptions, it's hard. Yes. Okay. And then we have a comment that music music can be very memorable, but unfortunately, it's just there isn't a lot of content in there. So there's a trade-off as well. That's from Jansen M or Jansen M. I'm not sure.
And also the other thing with music is that like if you look at a list of I love listening to music in Yiddish and I am trying to learn some songs in Yiddish and I find it really, really helpful, especially as my vocab has improved. I can understand more. But if you look at lyrics to a lot of songs in English, they don't really make sense.
One
So
thing,
if we're trying to assume that in another language, it might be a bit difficult.
here's one way in which songs are great though. Um, if you have a language that has grammatical gender on nouns and you hear an adjective
Mm,
noun pairing, that's a great way because that you'll think, what's the gender of this word? And then you'll remember that it was done with a masculine adjective in this song. And then that's a good way of doing it. Or collocations, words that tend to be used together, like commit a crime in English. For some reason, we
mm.
say commit a crime instead of do a crime for most of the time. And so those kinds of things show up a lot in songs. Um, and, uh, and then finally, we have Joan Edelstein asking, are there certain qualities that make a teacher good? What's your opinion on that?
I think it's going to depend on the relationship between the teacher and the student because what would be a good teacher for me might be a bad teacher for someone else. It's the same thing with anything. Um, for me, a good teacher is somebody that I would, in a language context especially, is someone that I would want to spend time with outside of the class. It's someone that I enjoy talking to, and that I'm motivated to talk to and to see, because actually I think I see our Yiddish teacher more than most other people I know. So you want to be able to keep going back and to be able to spend time with them. Somebody that makes you feel confident, um, and like we were talking about, that you're in an environment where you're not being judged and you can just learn and make mistakes, and experiment with things, and someone that's really flexible. um, I think that's really important because there might be something that you're really interested in that week that you want to do, and you want to think of like creative ways to incorporate that into your language learning. And obviously, like if you're in a stock group class, that's going to be a lot more difficult. I tend to find that because of how I learn, those group classes don't really work for me. I much prefer having a more customized thing, where you can kind of be like, oh, let's talk about this thing that happened this week and what's the vocab for this and how can we talk about these things that are interesting.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's a really vital thing. For example, there's a Yiddish writer that I really love. And I've now two of her books are now in translation, and something that I want to build up to. I'm still not there yet because I've not been learning long enough, but eventually I want to be able to like in my class go over some of the books, and we've been able to talk about her and her work. I just haven't been able to explore the work in Yiddish yet. And having someone that can be flexible and seems to be interested in you as a person and
Mm-hmm.
seems to be willing to adapt to it, and it's not very like I have my method and I'm going to do this, and it's very top down. That has been really beneficial for me. What do you think?
So I think you've just come close to answering Joan's follow-up question, which is that is it a question of the methods or of the, the fit between you and the teacher? And I think
Both.
it's definitely both. It's better if the person, obviously if it's true that input-based methods are the ones that work the best, then if they also believe that, that's going to help. But otherwise, even if they hadn't heard about it before, um, you know, send them to the send them to the stream. Have them
Send them
hear,
to the Substack.
send them to the Substack links, etc. Um, and sort of try and turn them on to this idea. And if they're a flexible person, and or even if they're not convinced, but they know that you want to do it and they're willing to work with you on that, that can also work.
And the other thing as well is that like for me, I think because as we've spoken about, language learning is so personal. If they're interested in getting to know you on a personal level and figuring out what you're interested in, they can then come to you and be like, oh, hey, there's this really interesting thing that's happened, or hey, there's this like writer you might like, or a musician that you might like, or a YouTube video that you might like.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of level of personalized engagement that I think has been a game changer for me. But again, like the type of person that I would want to see is probably very different from some other people. Like I've seen this when it comes to like doctors and medical people. Like I don't need like a very like there tappy tappy type sympathetic person. They need to be kind and empathetic, but I don't do well with like gushy. And I think it's the same, whereas other people need different types of care and different types of communication and interaction. And that's going to be the same for whatever you're trying to learn, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I believe that is our time. So I want to just thank everyone for joining us for this unfortunately slightly shorter stream, but we'll make it up to you on Thursday, when we'll be doing some conlanging together. And to thank Natasha for coming and talking to us about language learning again. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, I will end with a little full screen sign off. Thank you all for joining us on this Tuesday, whether it's in the depths of February or the heights of February, I guess, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. We're very happy that you spent this time with us. And we will see you either on Thursday or next week. So thanks again.